Welcome to Another Round, a podcast by the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this episode, Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications and an 18-year veteran of the California legislature, takes another round to the state capitol to talk with Senator Ted Gaines. He represents the areas of the Central Valley in Northern California, including Sacramento, El Dorado, Placer, and the beautiful Shasta, Sierra, and Siskiyou counties. In an end-of-legislative session roundup, Tim and Senator Gaines discuss everything from illegal marijuana grow operations, learn how it's becoming an environmental crisis in the state, the lack of affordable housing, infrastructure, and of course, since this is California, taxes, and more taxes, and the senators fight to hold the line. Finally, as is another round tradition, Senator Gaines will tell us about his favorite wine as well as his favorite soft drink. Here's Tim.
Well, Senator Ted Gaines, welcome to Another Round with PRI. We're recording this just after the legislature has adjourned for the 2017 session, and on behalf of taxpayers everywhere, we're all exhaling after the legislature has adjourned. I know a top priority for you this year was how CalFire is spending the fire tax dollars paid by so many hundreds of thousands of Californians who live in state responsibility areas, and I know you tried to get a state audit of the issue. Why was that audit important, and what did you hope to learn?
Well, number one, we never needed a fire tax, and that's why we pay taxes. We ought to have a CalFire that's funded through our state income tax that we pay, and we shouldn't have to pay a fee. So, of course, that went through the legislature. I think it was an illegal tax, actually, and Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association is fighting that, and we're waiting with bated breath to see what the result is. Then the next question is, do we know how the money is being spent? You would think that sort of money would be spent for fire trucks or firefighters or to build firehouses, but no, none of that is happening. It's being used for quote-unquote fire prevention. Well, what is that? Is that going through a fire safe council and educating folks? Yeah, that's one of the elements. Maybe buying a wood chipper would be another element. Financially, the biggest struggle that I think we're suffering is that money is going into the general fund. And as a result, it gets mixed with regular budget dollars, and we don't know exactly where that money's going. So I asked for an audit. We wanted to track how much money was collected, how much went into the general fund, and then actually how much came back to help taxpayers prevent fires and provide defensible space and things of that nature.
One issue recently that you had some news on, I know that's been a big ongoing issue, has been illegal marijuana growth. The legislature has done a few things in recent years to address the issue. You sent a letter to the governor asking him to declare a state of emergency over the issue. What would a state of emergency do? How would that help address the problem? And then what additional steps do you think the state should take to address this crisis?
Things are out of control in Siskiyou County, and it's just happened in the last year and a half or so, because obviously marijuana has been grown both legally and illegally here in California for decades. But I was shocked at the dramatic growth of marijuana grows in Siskiyou County. I had a chance to meet with Sheriff Lopi. We went up in a CHP helicopter, and I saw in a very short flight over 100 grows. Of course, it looked like all of them were just under 100 plants, so federal law doesn't kick in. And Sheriff Lopi is in a real bind because there are only 4 deputies in the county, and that may include the sheriff. So clearly they don't have enough firepower, and it's out of control. It's illegal. They're massive grows. These are fenced-in facilities that are stealing water in some cases. You'll see above-ground swimming pools that are being filled with water. There's water trucks roaming all over the place. I saw over a dozen just in my short helicopter flight. And we have an environmental crisis on our hands. So, there was a study that was showing that just in the national forest lands, this is statewide, not just in Siskiyou County, that 731,000 pounds of solid fertilizer is being used, 491,000 ounces of concentrated liquid fertilizer fertilizer and over 200,000 ounces of toxic pesticides. We know in Siskiyou County that deer have been killed, other forest animals, and there's just no control. These are pesticides that are being used illegally. You cannot use these types of pesticides in the state of California. Plus, we have water that's being stolen, and we're trying to do everything we can to manage our water well. And so my message is, Fish and Wildlife, why don't you focus on the illegal grow of marijuana in Siskiyou County and stop badgering the farmers and ranchers who are trying to make an honest living. So it's been a real challenge. So we need help. And so I sent the letter to the governor saying we need the National Guard. We need the ability to capture statewide resources. We could use coordination with federal agents. We could use more help from Fish and Wildlife. And we need them to focus on this illegal marijuana grow issue, both from an environmental standpoint, but we also need their wardens that can go out on some of these marijuana busts. And they did participate in the last one, which I appreciate, but we need a lot more manpower to send a message that you're not going to grow marijuana illegally in California. And there was an initiative that was passed with certain guidelines. There have been ordinances put in place saying that you can grow 6 plants personally and up to 12 plants, and they have to be contained in a greenhouse. And if I'm seeing it from the air, we've got a huge problem. And so I've asked the governor for help, and we're going to see if he's able to respond and help us out.
So I know another of your big priorities this session, you had a bill, SB 11, that would protect taxpayers who may be the victims of a failure of a state tax website. So talk about your bill and how that would benefit taxpayers.
Here's the problem. The Board of Equalization's website goes down, and let's say it's hours before the deadline of a tax payment, and literally millions of people are filing their taxes online, and the website goes down, and you end up with like over 100,000 people that are impacted as a result of that website going down, and then they get penalized because they didn't make their payment on time. And so what this bill simply does is that in the event that there's a computer glitch and the BOE website goes down, there will be no penalty that would have to be paid by a taxpayer if they made their payment prior to the deadline. And they're going to put a system in place that would, in a sense, date stamp when that contact was made. And it's just a common sense piece of legislation. We got it out of both the Assembly and the Senate on a unanimous basis. It's on the governor's desk, and we're hopeful that he'll sign it.
One thing on that, I know we had the whole switchover of the BOE and that new agency. We've written columns on it. It's a very complex issue, the creation of this new tax agency. How would people's taxes be affected by that? And if you have any thoughts on that whole changeover too.
Yeah, absolutely. So there basically was legislation that was forced through the legislature very quickly, didn't give people much time to really review it and determine what the challenges were for the BOE. And there are challenges, clearly, but I'm not sure that the solution was the proper solution. So probably my biggest beef with the BOE reform is that you've taken away the ability of an ordinary Californian to represent themselves before the BOE for an appeal case. And 2/3 of the cases historically that were heard before the BOE on tax appeals were individuals that were not represented by an attorney or a taxpayer advocate. And so now you're going to go for many of these taxes and fees, not all, because the legislation basically reduced the responsibilities of the BOE back to its constitutional duties. So many taxes and fees are now going to be collected by this new bureaucracy, which I'm not sure is going to save the taxpayer one penny. In fact, I would argue that it's going to cost more, and we'll see how that all turns out. But now if you have an appeal, you're going to go to a 3-judge panel, and I will make a prediction that those 3 judges will be tax experts, and they're not going to be favorably impressed with someone's error that they made. Let's say it's a small business owner that has a delicatessen, and they're not going to show any empathy towards them. And their focus, the judge's focus and the bureaucracy's focus, will be more than ever one of how do we extract as much money as we can out of the taxpayer so that we can satisfy the budget of the beast down here in Sacramento. So, I'm going to be watching at it very closely. I am a taxpayer advocate, and I'm going to make sure that taxpayers are treated in a fair manner, regardless of which bureaucracy they're going through, whether it's through the BOE or these new entities that are outlined in the legislation.
So staying on taxes, which seems to be the story of the 2017 session, I'm going to get on my soapbox for a moment because this is something that has been annoying me in my neighborhood. We're putting in water meters all across the city, and my neighborhood is the victim of having the water meters put in this summer, and it's the biggest mess to go through. And I have a column coming out soon on this, so you can read all my experience yelling at the city on our water meter project. And then I always remember our friend Assemblyman Brian Jones had these little videos that he called "Are You Kidding Me?" and he would yell, "Are you kidding me?" when some wild proposal would come up. And I read that they've introduced a bill to have a water meter tax as SB 623, and I yelled, "Are you kidding me?" when I heard that one. So what are your thoughts on that bill and the idea of having some kind of a California water tax?
I consider that a natural resource that's owned by the citizens of the state of California, and therefore, why would you tax it? And again, this is a regressive tax, right? So it's going to hit everybody on an equal basis, which makes it much tougher on those on the lower end of economic spectrum. So again, I'm against that.
We had two big tax bills that drew a lot of attention here, the gas tax in the spring, and then just before summer recess, the cap and trade bill. And not too long ago, you put out a video, and I encourage everybody to go on Senator Gaines' website and check out this video. And you used the famous find the ball under the cup street game to talk about what cap and trade would mean for Californians. Explain what you meant with that and talk through how you think taxpayers will be impacted by the bills passed this year.
Sure. I think there's an argument to be made that to what degree are we really reducing CO2 emissions in the state of California? And through a cap and trade system, you basically allow people to continue to violate, and they buy these credits. But I'm more concerned about the impact, quite frankly, on the taxpayer, because they're going to bear the brunt of this cap and trade legislation, and it's going to be regressive in nature. And so what will happen is that violators are going to be taxed, and those expenses will be passed on to the consumer. And in fact, we had a letter sent to the LAO. I think it was Assembly Member Vince Fong who requested a response in a letter that he sent asking what is the impact on the price of gasoline here in the state of California. And the LAO, and I'm estimating I may be a few cents off, but I think they had indicated that the cost of gasoline will go up in a range between 16 cents a gallon, I think about 58 cents a gallon, I believe through 2020. And then thereafter, it would go from, the range would be between 24 and 73 cents a gallon. And I have a real problem with this, that, we continue to push regressive taxes in a state that is already so difficult and onerous to operate a small business in and even to afford to buy a house. So I think there are better paths and methods that we could be looking at. We could be looking at our environment even. What are we doing in terms of planting more trees? Because we actually need CO2 in the environment. So there's a lot of different pathways that I think we could take that would not put the burden on folks that are least able to afford it. I support infrastructure and would do a lot of things to reprioritize our budget. If I were governor, I would love to make it one of the top priorities because we've ignored it for decades, actually. I do give credit for Schwarzenegger. He took a stab at it and issued bonds, which helped us, but we still have a much bigger problem and it should be a bigger priority in the budget. But what SB 1's going to do is, I think it's effective November 1, you're going to see gas tax go up 12 cents a gallon, diesel tax go up 20 cents a gallon, and then the diesel tax is going to go, I believe, from 3.75% to 5.75%. So again, families, small businesses, those who are least able to afford it, the poor, are going to be hit with this regressive tax. Then on top of that, to add insult to injury, they're increasing our vehicle license fee. So we know that there are other states that charge as little as $12 a year to register your car in the state. Well, that's not true here in California. We pay a percentage of the value of the vehicle, which amounts to typically several $100s a year. When this vehicle registration fee goes in, and the fee will be anywhere from $25 to $175 a year per vehicle, vehicle, people are going to be impacted, and that goes into effect in January, and I think they're going to be angry. And so I am hopeful, because I'm hearing that the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association is moving forward on an initiative that will go on the ballot. I did everything I could to help in that regard. Actually crafted language for an initiative that would basically take it to the people and give them the opportunity to repeal the gas tax and let the voters decide whether they want a gas tax increase and require a 2/3 vote to do so.
Well, I know on the gas tax, my dad, who drives a 1980s Mercedes 300D diesel, is not happy about the tax increase for diesel. Staying on cars, I know cars are an area that you're really interested in, and I seem to recall back in the day you had some sort of like car caucus or working group on cars, and one of the issues that came to light in this last end of session push was the bill to increase rebates for zero-emission vehicles, and Assemblyman Phil Ting had a bill, I think it was something like $3 billion that he wanted to set aside every year for these rebates. And then at the end of session, the Democratic leadership and the governor agreed to $140 million in rebates. Yet the kicker was you had to make sure you were friendly to the auto workers union. So what are your thoughts on this? Is that the best way to go about encouraging people to buy zero-emission vehicles? Should state government be in the business of encouraging us to buy a certain kind of car or not?
Well, it's complicated because I think if government is involved, you need to be very careful. I've supported some of these rebate bills in the past, and because I saw it as a means of encouraging technology advancement. But if you're going to do it, you better do it in a fair way across the board, because I don't think we ought to be picking which technology is the right technology for the automobile industry. The latest piece of legislation we voted on had to do with this linkage of unionization with the electric car rebates for Tesla. And it is outrageous, but if you think about it, the government giveth and the government taketh, right? So you see the power of the unions here in California, which is very, very powerful, and the ability to work with the environmental community, and they've done this numerous times. You get the environmentalists along with labor, and they are a power and a force to be reckoned with, and that's exactly what's happening here. So what does it do to our economy? I think it encourages Elon Musk to look at other locations, and of course I fought very hard to try to get the Gigafactory here in California, and we lost that to Nevada. And when we take a look at Tesla's future growth, I think if they are forced into unionization, which doesn't even seem legal to me, so I think there'd be a huge challenge to that. But if that were the case, and I were Elon Musk, I would be looking at a second location to manufacture my cars, maybe keep some sort of presence in California, but I wouldn't be looking at doubling the size of that facility like he was intending to do here in California. So it'll be very interesting to see how that all plays out. I'm not anti-union. I just think that it has to be a level playing field. And if the workers in a particular plant want to unionize, they have that ability to do so. And they ought to be granted that ability to do so. It's just that when it's forced through a piece of legislation, that just smacks me as being improper, incorrect, and subject to legal challenge.
So housing was probably one of the most high-profile issues of the legislative session, and in the last week of session, that was probably the thing, legislators spent the most time on, was debating housing legislation. Housing's been a big issue for PRI this year. We had our brief on affordable, and we added our voice to the conversation of the role the free market can play in solving the housing crisis. It seems like the legislature, for the most part, took a different tactic. So what do you think of the bills that were passed in this last week of session, and do you think they will have much of an impact in alleviating the housing crisis? And if not, what kind of reforms would you like to see instead?
Yeah, I don't think they're going to be very helpful. I think it's interesting. We have a liberal legislature that has put laws into place that have created the housing crisis in California largely. Not entirely, because we have high property values here in California, so housing, I think, naturally is going to be higher here because people want to live here. But on a myriad of different areas, when we start setting aside open space, which I love open space. I love to have open space, but that also limits the amount of land available to provide housing. and to keep housing at an affordable cost. When we take a look at CEQA, which has really been bastardized, CEQA was intended to mitigate the environmental impact as a result of construction here in the state. That's very laudable, and I would agree with that. But what has happened is that it's been used again with the environmental community and labor, and they've coordinated together on opportunities to litigate, to either stop projects outright through the courts or to slow them down to the point where you miss the window. Let's say the economy turns and suddenly you can't move forward with your project, or to bankrupt the project itself. And when we look at the housing package that came through, I heard a bill that came through housing committee that had to do with providing union wages, prevailing wage in housing. And that is not the pathway to provide affordable housing. And I'm not against unionization of workforces. Kaufman and Broad, KB Homes has a unionized workforce. Good for them. I'm hoping that they had the freedom and the ability to decide, the employees did, as to whether to unionize or not. And they've done that. So I think CEQA needs to be reformed. That would probably be the biggest step, is reforming that process. And I'm not saying getting rid of it. I think you could clean it up. You could narrow it back down to its original intent, and you could expedite it and say that the courts need to hear these cases in 120 days or whatever that time frame needs to be. And we've had some one-offs go through like that I've actually supported, but that ought to be the rule for everybody. And you could speed the process up. We don't need to make sure the court's got enough money so that they can handle that influx. But that and this regulation in general. So let's take a look at new housing construction requires a home to be sprinklered, and that could cost anywhere from $8,000 to $10,000 per home. Well, what if I don't want my home sprinklered? Could I order a home without sprinklers? No, it's mandated here in California. Well, what is the impact on the housing market? We looked at a study that I think came from the Home Builders Association that indicated that for every $1,000 increase in housing, 17,500 people cannot afford a home in California. And so when we start looking at, say, 10 grand, we're talking, for a sprinklered home, you're talking about 175,000 people that fall out of that affordability. They were just at the cusp, and that increased cost has put them out of the ability to buy a home. We're also talking about mandated solar. Why can't I make that decision? I don't need to be mandated and dictated to the cost of that, even with rebates. I think for kind of a smaller home would be about 10 grand. So we need to loosen the regulations, not eliminate them, but make them more business friendly and make them really more home buyer friendly. Included in these packages was a fee on real estate transactions, and it's not just a single fee. It's basically every document that goes through escrow is going to be charged a $75 fee. Again, you're increasing the cost of someone getting into a home by increasing these fees. And what we could do, and then the fee is being collected to help build affordable housing. Well, why don't we reform the regulation? Why don't we reform CEQA? Why don't we reduce the number of mandates, and you could get at least the price of housing down by tens of thousands of dollars per unit right here in California.
So I'd say the other big thing that characterized this legislative session was protest. And it seemed like every session almost, you were debating some resolution that some Democrat legislator had filed against Donald Trump or something the Trump administration had put forward. And I think a lot of people are wondering, should the legislature really be spending their time on their soapbox rather than legislating or finding solutions? What are your thoughts on the legislature positioning themselves as the number one adversary for Donald Trump?
Sure. Well, we're elected officials, and we can, all of us enjoy First Amendment right. So to my colleagues across the aisle, they clearly have the right to do that and set the agenda as they see fit. But I would argue that it's not productive. If you want to work with an administration which controls purse strings for dollars flowing into the state of California, that we ought to be figuring out ways that we can work together. And one of those areas would be in infrastructure. And I'm a huge advocate of building good infrastructure. President Trump has talked about $1 trillion investment in infrastructure across the United States. And California is a huge state. We have the potential potential of receiving hundreds of billions of dollars probably here in California. So I would say that it's better to let cooler heads prevail and to figure out areas where you can work together. Clearly, we're going to have disagreements, and I can understand that they would voice those, but if it becomes unhinged, that it doesn't help anybody. And we need to make sure that we're being respectful of one another on the floor and that we have a sense of civility and decorum, because we are the leadership. And I think our constituents demand that of us. I think there was a kind of a guttural feeling by liberals that they couldn't believe that Trump was elected. And I think it shocked a lot of America. And I voted for Trump, and I wasn't sure if he was going to make it past the finish line. If you listen to the media, they were clearly indicating that he was not going to make it, and he did. And so I think we have a great opportunity to move forward here in the country and in California, and we can do it on a bipartisan basis. And I always want my colleagues to know across the aisle that I'd love to work with them in how we can solve problems working with the Trump administration.
You know, I've worked here 18 years, and it seems like there hasn't been an uglier session than this one. The tone very dark, and, you know, even though this is a very partisan place, it's partisan to the extreme this year. And we've had these kind of reforms in recent years. We had the 72-hour in print rule, kind of increase accountability and transparency. We've had kind of the change in term limits, you know, that was supposed to change from, you know, you get elected and you're off running for the next thing to you're around here much. Taking that all in, and, you know, this really was the first session where all these were in place. What's your view on the state of our legislature and political system today with all of these in place? Some people might look at what they saw this session and might fear for our democracy a little bit. What's your view now that we're done with the session? We can kind of sit back and take stock of all of this.
I am concerned about our democratic republic in America, and I'm concerned about governance here in California. I think I've never seen it this bad. I was elected in 2006, so this is the worst that I've seen, and I think a lot of what's happening is our colleagues across the aisle are getting pushed by their far left. The Bernieite crowd is really after them and creating a lot of pressure. I thought it was interesting just more recently when you had Nancy Pelosi meet with the president on the DACA issue, and she was reviled at I think it was a DACA rally that she went to. And here she is trying to figure out if there's a solution. So I'm very concerned about our state. I think the fact that you have single party governance gives hubris to the Democrats, and in many cases they're going too far. And even the governor has warned them a couple of times. And I have seen things toned down a little bit in the last month or two on the Senate floor. So I think we need to understand that we're Americans first. We have been given a tremendous gift by generations before us in a democratic republic that is unique around the world, and that we ought to be doing everything we can to retain it. And history has taught us that there are plenty of examples of civilizations imploding, and so we need to be serious about that and govern in a responsible manner, whether it's from the left or the right. I'm a conservative, but I think those in power here in California need to keep that in mind.
Well, we always end these podcasts on a fun note, and you might think talking about some of these topics, it might drive some of our listeners to drink. So why don't we talk about wine and our favorite beverages? We always ask our guests to share their favorite wine recommendations with our listeners. So representing one of the best wine regions of the state, I know you will have a recommendation there, but I also know that you are a root beer aficionado. So share with our listeners, what should they look for in a good root beer? And, you know, are there a couple that you recommend that would be good for them to try at home?
Thank you. I am a huge root beer fan. There's a number that I like. Probably the top one would be River City root beer. I just buy it here locally, and it is very, very tasty. Typically, I like a root beer with cane sugar in it, a little vanilla, and it's so tasty. I love A&W root beer if I'm just getting something at the grocery store that's easy to find. I always love to go to some place that has root beer on tap. And so the Hofbrau, which I used to go to as a kid, and used to get it in a mug that was ice cold. It had like the frost on it. Pour the root beer into it, and then I'm not a very big drinker, but I will have a glass of wine here and there. And we have some excellent wines in El Dorado County in my Senate district, and I would say that Boger Winery is one of my favorites. It's just a beautiful setting off of Carson Road, and they've got a great wine tasting room. You can see the vineyards on the rolling hills surrounding it, and they make a nice Sauvignon Blanc that I enjoy, and I'll give you a little description. This is how they describe it. Tropical aromas of pineapple and banana with a hint of apricot on the end. This wine is soft and fleshy with a clean, bright finish. So I'm not a connoisseur. I'm just telling you that's how they're describing it.
Thanks to our guest, Senator Ted Gaines, and to Tim and I for that great interview. To stay up to date with Senator Gaines, go to his Twitter account @TedGaines. Please join us for our next episode in another end of legislative session wrap-up with veteran California journalist Steve Greenhut. Also, mark your calendars for PRI's annual gala on November 1st, 2017. Our keynote speaker is Silicon Valley entrepreneur Peter Thiel. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to Another Round with PRI at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for Another Round with PRI.